A couple more questions. The U.S. criticized the ruling, the ICJ ruling, that the Israeli occupation of Palestine is illegal. Why would you do that? Because you guys, I mean, just want to learn. You are a signatory to 242, 338, and so on, which speak very clearly on, what is occupied territory and so on. Why would you be opposed to a statement that is stating the obvious, actually, that the West Bank and East Jerusalem?
So if you look closely at the response that we gave to people that asked for our take on this ruling on Friday, what we said is that we have been clear that the Israeli government's support for settlements is inconsistent with international law and, of course, runs contrary to the cause of peace. And that we respect the role the International Court of Justice plays in the peaceful settlement of disputes. But what we are concerned about is that parties will use the court's advice as a pretext for further unilateral actions that will just deepen divisions and make the cause of establishing an independent Palestinian state more difficult to achieve. So we're clear on what we think about the settlement program, and we're also clear about what we think the ultimate outcome ought to be here, which is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, and that's what we continue to pursue.
Right. I mean, your position is very clear on the occupation, very clear on the pursuit of a two-state solution and so on, and the settlement, all this. But the Israelis are not responding. Now, you continue to say that the best or the most feasible path forward on this is negotiation. But then we have the legislative body of Israel come out and say, we're not going to negotiate on this issue. So why not then, take this matter into some sort of international forum?
Because we believe the best outcome, ultimately, to establish an independent Palestinian state, and it's important to remember the practical goal that we want to see achieved. Not votes at international bodies that don't do anything, not rhetorical statements that don't do anything. We want to see the actual establishment of an independent Palestinian state. And in our judgment, to get there, it is going to require a negotiation. And it's a very difficult process. Obviously, there's a reason why this dispute has been dragging on for decades now. But we continue to push for the establishment of a Palestinian state, and we continue to look at ways to come out of the current conflict and get a ceasefire and build a ceasefire into lasting peace and build a ceasefire into enduring stability, and ultimately push for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Not to say that it's easy. Of course, it's not easy, but in our judgment, that is the route that has the ultimate best chance of success.
Lastly, on the water, Israel is using water as a weapon, according to different reports in Gaza. I mean, it's like water has been cut off by 94%. Are you aware of this situation?
I haven't seen that specific report, but I can tell you that we have been working to try and get food and, of course, water into the people of Gaza. We have been working to try and get pipelines turned back on. There have been times that Israel has made progress working with local Palestinian agencies to try to get water turned back on, and then you had events that led to pipes being disrupted again. Obviously, the provision of water is incredibly important. It's why, for another example, we've worked to get fuel into Gaza to allow desalination plants to run so they can provide water to the people who need it, and that continues to be a priority for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll just come back to the ICJ. So in your response to that, you're talking about what you don't want parties to use this opinion as a pretext for further unilateral actions. What are we really talking about there? What is it that you're concerned that a court's decision will be used as a pretext for?
So I don't want to prescribe any from here, but just as we have criticized unilateral actions that Israel has taken, because we don't find them conducive to the goal of reaching peace, we would see actions by other parties. So you've seen us, for example, when other countries have come out and recognized a Palestinian state as a unilateral action. It's, of course, the right of any country to make that decision, but we see that ultimately as harmful to the ultimate goal of negotiating the establishment of a Palestinian state. So without prescribing any exact options that various parties may take, it's that kind of unilateral thing that outside the context of negotiations, we just ultimately don't find helpful.
Right. I think like what Said was kind of getting at, if you're basically saying we don't sort of see this court's opinion as useful, but that's not really what courts are for, right? They're not there as bodies to make useful political interventions in issues. This is an issue where you say you support international law, but in international law, the concept of international law means that there are courts that can rule on these kind of things, right? And now we've got the ICC and the ICJ have both taken actions regarding Israel in the last few months, and in both cases you've sort of pretty strongly spoken out about those courts interventions. So, how can you say that you support international law when whenever the bodies of international law act, you denounce it?
So various parties or observers to international fora or courts here can both respect a court system and disagree with rulings that courts make. You see that all the time, just thinking about domestically here at home, where an administration can respect the work that the courts do, but disagree with an individual that ruling that comes down, be concerned about the practical implications of a decision that a court makes, plan to an appeal. It is, I think, keeping in practice with the way people respond to court decisions all around the world. And it's the case here, where we can respect the role that the courts play, but also be concerned with the implications of decisions that they make. And when we have those concerns, I think it's incumbent upon us to give voice to them.
But by doing that, you're signaling to your ally Israel that it doesn't need to follow those rulings.
Yeah, so this was an advisory ruling, first of all. But I think what it signals is that when we have concerns, we're going to speak to them publicly.
A couple of topics. On also Kurmashova, we learned.
Thank you very much. Going back to the ceasefire deal, actually, Secretary's remarks, the 10-yard line, was on Friday, just before Sunday, President Biden's decision to drop out the race. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu arrives in a very politically uncertain environment.
I was I feel dots being connected here that don't necessarily connect, but go ahead. Maybe I shouldn't. Go ahead. No,
I would just, I'd just like to ask, should we still expect that ceasefire deal put forward by President Biden stand as effective as it would be, given he's not running for the second term now? Because there are reports that Prime Minister Netanyahu might be dragging his feet until November to see who would be the next president of the United States.
So absolutely. And I think you have to remember that when the president outlined that proposal publicly, it was a proposal that had been put forward by the government of Israel. It was Israel's proposal. We had obviously been involved in the development of that proposal as our role in one of the mediators to the negotiations, but it was ultimately an Israeli proposal. Now, as I said in response to, I don't remember whose question it was earlier, we continue to be involved in those negotiations and trying to move them forward to get them across the line. And what we have seen is, on behalf of the Israeli government, is them engaging, also trying to get a final deal. Now, there are things that they have put forward that ultimately are difficult, just as there are things that Hamas has put forward that are difficult to resolve. But we believe that ultimately those all ought to be resolvable. Again, always with the caveat, that doesn't mean they will be resolved. Negotiations are tough, and I think as the Secretary said on Friday, that sometimes the last 10 yards can be the hardest length to cover. But we have made important progress, and we continue to push to try and get it over the line.
Yeah.
So
Let me finish talking.
Might be the hardest to cover, but it doesn't take 3 days. I mean, that's a pretty crappy red zone offense.
So if you
3-4 days now.
So if you look at how long we have been involved in these negotiations,
I
this
get
is
it,
not
but he said it on
the
Friday.
analogy does not carry over to a 60-minute football game. We have been involved in these negotiations for some time, going back months. If you
Like an 8-month, a 9-month.
going back months
game.
is obviously.
Sounds more like a cricket test match than it does.
Here you go with cricket again. You're now testing my cricket knowledge again.
Well, let's talk water polo then.
Definitely not.
You don't have any concerns that the process would be slower now, given the president is not running for a second term because of the uncertainty for a second term of.
I do not. Look, ultimately, we believe a ceasefire deal is in the interest of the government of Israel. It's in the interest of the Palestinian people. That's why it ought to be agreed to, and we'll continue to push for it as hard as we can. Now, Hiba, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The meeting between the Prime Minister and the President doesn't take place tomorrow or before that Secretary traveled to Asia. Do we expect a separate meeting between Secretary Blinken and Netanyahu?
I just don't. It's hard for me to answer that without knowing when the meeting with the Prime Minister is going to be scheduled. So before I get into what I would expect if something doesn't happen. I think I'll wait and see what actually does.
Thank you.
Ask me on Wednesday if it hasn't happened yet, then maybe.